It was there, just like the picture. The forest green station wagon, though the green was now mostly a memory, hidden under a thick blanket of rust and moss. It was wedged between two massive fir trees, its front end crumpled against a large boulder. The windows were all shattered, dark, empty eyes staring out at the woods. Vines snaked through the broken windshield, wrapping around the steering wheel in a grotesque embrace. The sense of violation was overwhelming. This was a place of violence. A place of secrets. Frank felt the air leave his lungs. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times over 19 years, but the reality was a punch to the gut. It was real. He had failed them. He had been right here, so close. Miller, younger and less haunted, was all business. "License plate is still on," he called out, his voice muffled by the oppressive quiet. He scraped away a layer of grime. LCB-4-2-2. Frank didn't need to write it down. The number was seared into his memory. LCB-422. The Petersons' car, it's them, Frank said, his voice barely a whisper. He approached the driver's side, his heart hammering against his ribs. The door was wedged shut, the metal bent and twisted. He and Miller put their shoulders into it, grunting with effort. With a screech of tortured metal, the door gave way, swinging open. The smell that hit them was thick, a putrid combination of mildew, rot, and wet earth. The interior was a disaster. The seats were ripped and covered in mold. The floor was a carpet of dead leaves and dirt that had blown in over 2 decades. There was no sign of them. No bodies, no bones, just an empty, decaying metal shell. Relief and horror warred within him. They weren't here, but where were they? His gaze fell to the back seat, and there it was. Half buried in the muck on the floor was a splash of faded color. Pink. He knelt down, his old knees protesting, and carefully brushed away the leaves. It was a backpack, a child's backpack, with a faded cartoon unicorn on it. Lily's his. Breath hitched. This was it. The first tangible piece of their lives he had touched in 19 years. It felt both sacred and profane. He could almost feel the ghost of the little girl who had once carried it. His hands were trembling as he reached for the zipper. It was stiff, corroded with time and moisture. He worked it gently, his heart pounding in his ears, the sound of his own blood roaring against the silence of the forest. The zipper moved an inch, then another. He pulled it open. Inside, nestled in the damp, decaying fabric, was a plastic Ziploc bag. The seal was still intact, a small miracle of preservation. And inside the bag was a single object, a disposable camera, the kind you bought at a drugstore, used once, and took back for developing. Frank stared at it, his mind reeling. A camera, with a roll of undeveloped film inside. 19 years of secrets, trapped in a light-tight plastic box, waiting in the dark. What had Lily seen? What had she photographed in the last moments of her life? The cliffhanger wasn't just about what was in the backpack. It was the sudden, terrifying realization that the story of what happened to the Peterson family hadn't ended here in this ravine. It had been captured, and the proof might be in his hands. He looked up from the camera, his eyes scanning the oppressive, silent trees that surrounded them. The forest wasn't just a tomb, it was a witness, and it had held its secrets long enough. The real shock wasn't finding the car. It was the gut-wrenching possibility that the truth, in all its horror, was about to be exposed. The lab technician handled the disposable camera as if it were an unexploded bomb. Frank Harding watched from the other side of the glass, his reflection, a ghostly, haggard overlay on the sterile scene. Every tick of the clock on the wall was a hammer blow against his patience. 19 years. It all came down to a roll of cheap film, preserved by a Ziploc bag and a child's love for her unicorn backpack. The technician, a young woman with unnervingly steady hands, finally emerged from the darkroom. She held a set of glossy 4x6 prints. She didn't look at him. She looked at the floor. That was all he needed to see. "There are 24 exposures, Detective," she said, her voice low, clinical. "The first 20 are what you'd expect. Camping pictures. The lake, the parents, the little girl. She slid them across the counter. Frank picked them up, his calloused fingers fumbling slightly. The colors were faded, tinged with the chemical decay of time, but the images were clear. There was Mark Peterson, beaming, holding up a string of laughably small fish. There was Sarah, her face tilted towards the sun, a genuine, unguarded smile on her lips as she read a book in a camping chair. And there was Lily. Lily everywhere. Lily roasting a marshmallow that was on fire. Lily wearing her father's oversized hiking boots. Lily asleep in the tent, her face angelic and peaceful. A lifetime of happiness condensed into 20 frames. It was a gut punch. This was the family he had failed to find. The family that had been erased, and the last 4. Frank asked, his voice thick. The technician took a deep breath. They're different, they're dark. Taken from inside the car, it looks like, through the back window. She pushed the final 4 photographs across the counter. Frank looked at the first one, picture 21. It was blurry, a chaotic slash of green and brown, the view from a moving car bouncing on an unpaved road. The forest canopy closed in overhead, creating a tunnel of oppressive green. The light was fading. Picture 22. The car had stopped. The image was clearer now. Through the rear windshield, another vehicle was visible. A truck, an old beaten-up pickup, dark blue or maybe black, its paint chipped and peeling. It was parked close behind them, its grille filling the frame like a predator's snarl. There was a man in the driver's seat, but his face was obscured by the glare on the windshield. A faceless silhouette of menace. Picture 23. The man was out of the truck now. He was walking towards their car. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dirty baseball cap and a flannel shirt. He carried something in his hand. A tire iron. His face was still indistinct, a blur of motion and shadow, but the intent was unmistakable. It radiated from the photograph, a wave of pure malevolence. Frank's blood ran cold. This was it. The moment everything went wrong. Little Lily, sitting in the back seat, had raised her camera and captured the monster who had come for them. He stared at the final photograph. Picture 24. The man was at the driver's side window now, his face turned towards Mark Peterson. The angle was awkward, taken from a child's perspective, looking up. The man's face was finally in focus, and Frank Harding knew him. The world tilted on its axis. The air rushed from his lungs. It was a face he saw every year at the department's annual barbecue. A face he'd shared beers with. A face that belonged to a man who wore a badge. Sheriff John Caldwell. Not the current sheriff, the one before. The man who had run the county for 30 years, a local legend, a pillar of the community. He had been in charge of the initial search. He had stood beside Frank at press conferences, his arm around Frank's shoulder, his expression a mask of grim concern, promising the public they would do everything in their power to bring the Petersons home. He had been the one to officially declare it a cold case 2 years later, citing a lack of leads. The betrayal was so profound, so absolute, it was physically nauseating. Frank stumbled back from the counter, leaning against the wall for support. Caldwell. It was always Caldwell. The pieces of the puzzle, scattered for 19 years, slammed together in his mind with sickening force. John Caldwell was more than just a sheriff. He was an institution in Clallam County. He had inherited the badge from his father. A man who had run the county with an iron fist and a network of favors that passed for law. Caldwell's reign was softer on the surface, all folksy charm and community pancake breakfasts, but the iron was still there, underneath. He owned half the businesses in Port Angeles through shell corporations and silent partnerships. He controlled the logging permits, the fishing licenses, the zoning board. Nothing happened in that county without his knowledge and his cut. He was a king in a kingdom of tall trees and quiet corruption. His past was a tapestry of whispers and rumors that no one dared voice too loudly. Stories of rivals whose businesses mysteriously burned down. Of journalists who got a little too curious and found themselves run out of town on trumped-up charges. He was a man with a carefully constructed folksy facade and a core of pure, ruthless greed. Frank had always known Caldwell was dirty. Every cop in the state knew it. But they thought it was just kickbacks, sweetheart deals, not this. Not a family. And the Petersons. Who were they? Frank pulled out the old case file, his hands no longer trembling but rigid with a cold, focused rage. Mark Peterson wasn't just a happy-go-lucky camper. He was an environmental surveyor from Seattle. His firm had been hired by the state to assess the environmental impact of a proposed new logging operation deep in the Olympic National Forest. An operation that, Frank now realized with dawning horror, was on land that bordered a massive tract owned by a holding company. A holding company that Frank would bet his pension was controlled by John Caldwell. Sarah Peterson was a paralegal. She had a reputation for being meticulous, for digging into things. The case file noted that in the weeks before their disappearance, she had made several inquiries to the county clerk's office regarding land deeds and corporate ownership records. She was helping her husband. They were putting together a report that would have stopped Caldwell's logging deal dead in its tracks, a report that would have exposed the illegal clear-cutting he was already doing, the streams he was poisoning, the fortune he was making by gutting the very land he was sworn to protect. They weren't just a family on a camping trip. They were a threat, and John Caldwell did not tolerate threats. The hidden witness was Lily, a 6-year-old girl with a disposable camera. She hadn't just been taking pictures of her vacation. She had been doing what her parents were doing, documenting. She saw the scary man in the truck behind them, and she did what any child of an observant, meticulous mother would do. She took a picture. She recorded the evidence. The scene played out in Frank's mind, a silent, horrific movie. The Petersons, driving home, happy, tired from their trip. They take a shortcut Caldwell's deputy suggested, a quiet logging road. The road becomes a trap. Caldwell's truck appears behind them, blocking them in. Mark gets out of the car, trying to be reasonable. Is there a problem, officer? Maybe he even recognized the sheriff. And Caldwell, the man of the law, raises the tire iron. Frank felt a surge of bile in his throat. He had to get out of there. He grabbed the photos, stuffing them into his coat pocket, and walked out of the lab, past the concerned look of the technician, and into the cold, sterile hallway. He didn't go back to his desk. He went to the archives, the basement room where old case files went to die. He needed to see the witness statements again. He needed to see who had lied. He found the Peterson boxes, coated in a fine layer of dust. He pulled out the file for a man named Dale Sterling. Dale was a local hunter, a loner who lived in a cabin not far from where the car was found. He was the one who claimed to have seen the Peterson station wagon the day they disappeared. He'd told Frank and Caldwell, his eyes shifty, his story just a little too vague, that he'd seen them turn off the highway onto a logging road. He said they looked fine, like they were just out for a drive. His statement had been the one that sent the initial search in the wrong direction, away from the ravine, towards a different part of the forest. Caldwell had personally vouched for Dale. Good man, he'd said. A little rough around the edges, but his word is solid. Dale Sterling, he was the third man, the one who set the trap. Frank remembered him now, a weaselly man with a perpetual tremor in his hands and an air of desperation. He was one of Caldwell's creatures, a man indebted to the sheriff for overlooking his poaching and illegal trapping. He was the perfect pawn. Frank sat on the dusty floor of the archive room, surrounded by the ghosts of the Peterson family. The victim, a family who stumbled into a web of corruption they never could have imagined, killed, not for passion or hatred, but for profit. The antagonist, a beloved public servant who was, in reality, a ruthless monster, a man who would slaughter a family to protect his empire. And the hidden witness, a 6-year-old girl, whose final act on this earth was to capture the face of her killer. The weight of it all pressed down on him. The injustice was a physical force, a pressure in his chest. That made it hard to breathe. For 19 years, Caldwell had walked free. He had retired with honors, a celebrated hero. He lived in a sprawling lodge overlooking the Puget Sound. His fortune built on the bones of a family he had buried in the woods. And he, Frank Harding, had shaken the man's hand. He had bought the lies. He had let the killer supervise the investigation into his own crime. The rage was so pure, so white-hot, it burned away the fatigue of the last 2 decades. This wasn't a cold case anymore, it was a conspiracy. It was a murder, and Frank wasn't a retiring detective anymore. He was the agent of a 19-year-old ghost. He stood up, the dust motes dancing in the single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. He had the truth in his pocket. But the truth wasn't enough. Caldwell was still powerful. He still had half the county in his pocket. A set of faded photographs. Against a man like that, it would be his word against the legends. He needed more. He needed the other witness. He needed Dale Sterling. He had to find him. He had to make him talk. The hunt wasn't over. It had just begun. Frank drove north, the Seattle skyline receding in his rearview mirror like a bad memory. The city felt alien to him now, its order and civility, a thin veneer over the kind of darkness he was driving towards. He was heading back into Caldwell's kingdom. The highway wound its way along the coast. The grey waters of the Puget Sound on one side, the dense, dark wall of the forest on the other. It was beautiful country, but to Frank, every shadow between the trees looked like a grave. He didn't call ahead. He didn't check in with the local precinct. He was off the books, a ghost himself now. He knew that showing up in Port Angeles with questions about John Caldwell would be like waving a red flag at a bull. The news would get back to the old sheriff before he'd finished his first cup of coffee. Caldwell's roots ran deep. They were tangled around the courthouse, the sheriff's department, the local paper. To challenge him here was to challenge the town itself. He found Dale Sterling's address in the old case file. A cabin on the edge of the national forest, not far from the town of Forks. As he drove, the signs of Caldwell's influence were everywhere. The Caldwell Logging Co. trucks rumbling down the highway, heavy with ancient timber. The Caldwell Marina, the new wing of the local hospital with a bronze plaque bearing his name. The man hadn't just run this county, he had branded it. Dale's cabin was less a home and more a surrender. It was a dilapidated shack, leaning to one side as if tired of standing. The yard was a graveyard of rusted machinery and junk. A mangy dog, chained to the porch, let out a half-hearted bark as Frank's truck crunched up the gravel driveway. Dale Sterling emerged from the cabin, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. He was older, thinner, more weathered than Frank remembered, but the same fear was in his eyes. It was a permanent fixture now, etched into the lines on his face. He saw Frank get out of the truck, and a flicker of recognition, followed by pure panic, washed over him. Harding. Dale's voice was a dry rasp. What the hell are you doing here? We need to talk, Dale, Frank said, his voice even, calm. He kept his hands visible, away from his jacket, where his service weapon was holstered. We got nothing to talk about, Dale said, taking a step back towards the cabin door. The dog whined, sensing its owner's terror. That was a long time ago. I told you everything I know. You told me what he wanted you to tell me, Frank said, taking a step closer. I'm not here about the Petersons, not really. I'm here about John Caldwell. The name hung in the air between them, heavy and dangerous. Dale flinched as if he'd been struck. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know anything. They found the car, Dale, Frank said, his voice dropping, becoming more intimate, more conspiratorial. Down in the ravine off the old logging road, the one you forgot to mention. Dale's face went pale, the color draining from his weathered skin. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. They found it, and I found this, Frank said. He reached into his pocket, but he didn't pull out the photos. He pulled out a single, grainy image he'd printed from the case file, a picture of Dale from 19 years ago, looking shifty and scared as he gave his statement. To Caldwell, Frank held it up. You look scared here, Dale. You still look scared. You've been scared for 19 years. I want to know. Why? Dale's eyes darted around the yard, as if expecting Caldwell's men to materialize from between the trees. You gotta go, he whispered, his voice trembling. You can't be here, he'll know. He knows everything. Then tell me. Frank pressed, his voice hard now. Tell me what he did. Tell me what he made you do. Dale's composure finally shattered. His face crumpled, and a dry, racking sob escaped his lips. He'll kill me, man, you don't understand. He'll kill me just for talking to you. He'll kill you anyway, Frank said, the words cold and brutal. You're a loose end, Dale, the only one left. He let you live for 19 years. Because nobody was looking. But I'm looking now, and if I found the car, he knows it's only a matter of time before I find you. Your only chance is to talk to me. The cruelty of the logic was undeniable. Dale was trapped, a pawn in a game he had no hope of winning. He looked at Frank, his eyes pleading. What do you want from me? The truth, Frank said. Everything. From the beginning. And so, it spilled out. The whole sordid story, whispered in the shadow of the rotting cabin. The words tumbling over each other in a torrent of fear and guilt. Caldwell had owned Dale for years, ever since he'd caught him poaching a buck on protected land. Instead of arresting him, Caldwell had put him on his payroll. A little intimidation here, a little vandalism there. Dale was his go-to muscle for the dirty work. The day the Petersons disappeared, Caldwell had called him. He said a couple from Seattle were snooping around, threatening his logging business. He needed Dale to run them off the road, scare them a little. Just scare them. That's what he'd said. He told me to block the logging road. Dale choked out, tears streaming down his face now. He said he just wanted to talk to them. I believed him. I swear to God, I believed him. Dale had waited. He saw the Petersons' station wagon turn onto the road. He waited 5 minutes, then followed, blocking the exit. He saw truck pull in behind them. He heard shouting. He saw Mark Peterson get out of the car, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. And he saw John Caldwell, the decorated sheriff of Clallam County, swing a tire iron. He saw Mark go down. He heard the woman scream. He hit him, Dale stammered, his body shaking. And then he went for the woman. He dragged her out of the car, and the little girl. Oh God, the little girl was screaming. Dale had panicked. This wasn't scaring someone. This was a slaughter. He'd thrown his truck in reverse and fled, the screams of Sarah and Lily Peterson chasing him down the road. Later that night, Caldwell had shown up at his cabin. He was calm. His clothes were clean. He told Dale what had happened. He said, it was an accident, a confrontation that got out of hand. He said they were all in it together now. He gave Dale the story to tell the police the story about seeing the Petersons turn off the highway, looking happy. He told Dale to keep his mouth shut, and in return, he could live. He said he took care of it, Dale whispered, his eyes wide with a 19-year-old horror. He said he pushed the car into the ravine, and that he buried them. Somewhere else. Somewhere no one would ever find them. He looked me in the eye and he said, they're just gone, Dale. And if you ever want to see another sunrise, you'll remember that. The confession hung in the air, sickening and absolute. Frank felt a cold, hard knot form in his stomach. This was it. This was the testimony he needed. But as he looked at the broken, terrified man in front of him, he knew it wasn't going to be that easy. You have to testify, Dale, Frank said. Dale shook his head frantically. No, I can't. You don't get it. His people are everywhere. The deputies, the judges, they're all his. I sign a piece of paper, I'm a dead man before it even gets filed. The escalation was brutal. The conspiracy wasn't just Caldwell, it was the system he had built around him. Frank had the truth, but the truth was useless if the man who could tell it was too terrified to speak. The injustice was no longer just about the past, it was about the present, about the suffocating power that Caldwell still wielded. Even in retirement, Frank's phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from a trusted colleague back in Seattle. Be careful. Someone just ran your plates. A query. From the Clallam County Sheriff's Office. Frank's blood ran cold. They knew he was here. The system was already working against him. Caldwell had been alerted, He knows, Frank said, showing the text to Dale. He knows I'm here. He knows I'm talking to you. You're out of time, Dale. The terror in Dale's eyes morphed into something else. Pure, animal panic. He bolted. He shoved Frank aside and sprinted for the woods behind his cabin, crashing through the underbrush like a spooked deer. Dale, wait, Frank yelled, running after him. But Dale was gone, swallowed by the forest. Frank stood at the edge of the woods, his heart pounding. He had pushed too hard. He had cornered a frightened animal, and it had fled. He was alone, in the heart of his enemy's territory, and the enemy knew he was there. The conflict had escalated from a quiet investigation to an open confrontation. He had poked the hornet's nest, and now the hornets were coming. He got back in his truck, his mind racing. He had to find Dale before Caldwell's people did. But where would he go? As he pulled out of the driveway, he saw something that made his stomach clench. Parked half a mile down the road, tucked behind a curtain of trees, was a familiar vehicle. A Clallam County Sheriff's cruiser. It hadn't been there when he arrived. It was waiting. Watching. The betrayal was no longer a historical fact. It was an active, present threat. He was being hunted. He floored the accelerator, his truck fishtailing on the gravel road. He had to get out of there, disappear, and find a new way to fight. The rules had changed. This wasn't about justice anymore. It was about survival. He had the pieces of the puzzle, but the man who held the board was about to sweep them all away, and him along with them. The tension was no longer a slow burn. It was a raging fire, and he was standing in the middle of it. Frank drove for an hour, his eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The sheriff's cruiser didn't follow. It didn't have to. It was a message. We see you. We are everywhere. He felt like a man in a shrinking room, the walls of Caldwell's influence closing in on him. Dale was gone, spooked and useless. The photos were powerful, but circumstantial. Without Dale's testimony, it was a retired cop's word against a local hero's. It was nothing. He ended up in a cheap motel in Port Townsend, a town just outside the edge of Caldwell's immediate sphere of control. He paid in cash, using a fake name. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and despair. He sat on the edge of the lumpy bed, the 4 photographs spread out before him like a tarot reading of death. He stared at Caldwell's face in picture 20, the face of a monster hiding in plain sight. He felt a wave of utter hopelessness wash over him. He had failed. He had come all this way, unearthed a 19-year-old horror, only to be checkmated by a corrupt system. He had one last card to play, a desperate Hail Mary. He pulled out his phone and called the only person he knew who might be able to help. The only person who hated Caldwell as much as he now did, Marcus Thorne. Thorne was a disgraced journalist. 20 years ago, he'd been a rising star at the Seattle Times, a bulldog investigative reporter who had made a name for himself by taking on powerful people. His biggest target had been John Caldwell. Thorne had spent a year digging into finances, his logging deals, his network of corruption. He was close, so close, to exposing the whole rotten enterprise. And then his world had fallen apart. A source, a secretary from the sheriff's office, had been found dead in her car, an apparent suicide. The same week, Thorne was arrested. A bag of cocaine had been found in the trunk of his car during a routine traffic stop in Clallam County. He swore it was a plant, a setup. But he was convicted. His career was destroyed. His reputation was in tatters. He'd lost everything. Everyone knew Caldwell was behind it, but no one could prove it. Frank found him running a small independent news blog from his basement, a bitter, brilliant man, obsessed with the truth that had cost him his life. Harding Thorne's voice was a gravelly bark over the phone. To what do I owe the displeasure? Did you finally grow a conscience? I need your help, Marcus, Frank said, skipping the pleasantries. Help. Thorne laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. The last time a cop from Clallam County offered to help me, I ended up doing 18 months in state prison. No thanks. They found the Petersons' car, Frank said quietly. There was silence on the other end of the line. Frank could hear the faint sound of Thorne's breathing, and Thorne finally said, his voice stripped of its earlier bravado. "And I found what was inside it," Frank continued. "A camera. A disposable camera that belonged to the little girl." He told Thorne everything. The photos, the face of John Caldwell, the tire iron, the confession from Dale Sterling, the sheriff's cruiser waiting for him. As he spoke, he could feel the energy on the other end of the line shift from bitter cynicism to a laser-focused intensity. This was the story Thorne had been chasing his entire life, the one that had ruined him, and it was being handed to him on a silver platter. "Where are the pictures?" Thorne asked, his voice tight with excitement. "I have them," Frank said, "but they're not enough." Dale Sterling ran. "Without him, we have no living witness." "Maybe we do," Thorne said, a strange new energy in his voice. "Frank, my source. The one who died. Her name was Evelyn Reed. She was Caldwell's secretary for 15 years. She was terrified of him, but she hated what he was doing. She was the one feeding me the documents about the logging deals. The day before she died, she called me. She was frantic. She said, He knows I'm talking to you. I have to give you the insurance policy." We were supposed to meet the next day. I never saw her again. "Insurance policy?" Frank asked, sitting up straight. "What insurance policy?" "I don't know," Thorne admitted. "She never got to tell me, but she was smart, Frank, meticulous. She wouldn't have just given up, she would have hidden it. Something that would burn Caldwell to the ground if it ever came out. A hidden clue. A confession from the grave." The stakes were no longer just about the Petersons. They were about every crime Caldwell had ever committed. Every person he had silenced. Where would she hide it? Frank asked, his mind racing. Frank Evelyn was old school. She didn't trust computers. She trusted paper. And she trusted process. She was a county clerk for 20 years before she became Caldwell's secretary. She knew the system, the archives, the records rooms. She would have hidden it somewhere in plain sight. Somewhere no one would ever think to look. The archives, the dusty basement room where Frank had found Dale's file. He thought back to the rows and rows of boxes. A century of county history slowly turning to dust. It was a perfect hiding place. A needle in a haystack. "But what are we looking for?" Frank asked. "I don't know," Thorne said. "A diary, a ledger, a sworn affidavit. But I know Evelyn. It will be there, and it will be undeniable." The plot had twisted. This was no longer just about finding a witness. It was about finding a ghost's last will and testament. The tension cranked to a new, unbearable level. It was a race. Frank had to get back to the courthouse archives before Caldwell, alerted by Frank's snooping, decided to do some house cleaning of his own. "I'm going back," Frank said. "You can't," Thorne argued. "They're watching you. They'll pick you up the second you set foot in that courthouse." "I have to," Frank said. "It's the only way." "No," Thorne said. "We have to. But you're right, you can't be the one to do it." "But I can." The plan was audacious, reckless, and their only shot. Thorne, the disgraced pariah, would be the diversion. He would use his blog and his network of contacts to announce a new, explosive exposé on John Caldwell, promising to reveal everything. He would create a media firestorm, drawing all of Caldwell's attention, forcing him to focus on public relations and damage control. It would be Thorne's final, glorious act of journalistic kamikaze. While Caldwell was distracted, Frank would go back, not to the courthouse, but to the one place Caldwell would never expect. He was going to break into the old man's house. The logic was insane, but sound. If Evelyn had an insurance policy, she would have told Caldwell about it. It was the only thing that would have kept her alive as long as it did. Caldwell, paranoid and controlling, would not have left that kind of threat languishing in a public archive. He would have found it. And he would have kept it. A trophy of his victory. Reminder of his power. He was a narcissist, a predator. He would keep his souvenirs. The full, horrifying scope of the conspiracy was now clear. It wasn't just the murder of the Petersons. It was the murder of Evelyn Reed. It was the framing of Marcus Thorne. It was a decades-long reign of terror, orchestrated by one man and enabled by a system of fear. The next 24 hours were a blur of adrenaline and dread. Thorne published his blog post. The effect was instantaneous. The internet lit up. News vans began to descend on Port Angeles. Caldwell, forced out of his comfortable retirement, issued a furious denial, calling Thorne a liar and a lunatic. The chaos was the perfect cover. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, Frank Harding cut the phone line to Caldwell's sprawling lodge on the bluff overlooking the water. He disabled the alarm system, a skill he'd picked up in his early days on the force. He slipped through a downstairs window, a shadow in the house of the devil. The house was a monument to ego. Animal heads stared down from the walls. Pictures of Caldwell shaking hands with governors and senators lined the hallways. It was the home of a man who believed he was untouchable. Frank went straight to the study. It was a room of dark wood and leather, the air thick with the smell of cigar, smoke, and self-satisfaction. He searched the desk, the file cabinets, the bookshelves. Nothing. He felt a rising tide of panic. Had he been wrong? His eyes fell on a large, ornate safe, hidden behind a painting of a stormy seascape. Of course, he didn't have the combination. He didn't have time to crack it. He was about to give up when he noticed something. A small, brass key, left on the desk blotter. It was too small, too simple for a safe like this. It was for a lockbox. He scanned the room again. His eyes landed on a bookshelf filled with leather-bound classics. He ran his fingers along the spines. One of them, a copy of Moby Dick, felt different. It wasn't a book. It was a box, hollowed out to look like one. He pulled it from the shelf. There was a small keyhole on the side. The brass key fit. He turned the key. The lock clicked open. Frank lifted the cover. His breath caught in his throat. Inside was not a diary. It was not a ledger. It was a series of small cassette tapes, the kind used in a microcassette recorder. There were a dozen of them, each labeled with a date in neat, precise handwriting. Evelyn Reed's handwriting. And on top of the tapes was a single folded piece of paper. A sworn notarized confession. It was all there. Evelyn had been secretly recording her conversations with Caldwell for years. She had documented everything. The logging kickbacks, the extortion, the threats, the conspiracy to frame Marcus Thorne. And then Frank saw the last tape. The one on the bottom. It was labeled with a single chilling word. Peterson. This was it. The insurance policy. The hidden clue that changed everything. It wasn't just Dale's testimony anymore. It was Caldwell's own voice, confessing to his crimes, recorded by the woman he was about to murder. Frank grabbed the box and ran. He had the bombshell. He had the weapon that would not just expose a killer, but dismantle an empire. The tension had reached its absolute peak. The only thing left was to light the fuse. The courtroom was a pressure cooker. Every seat was filled. The air was thick with anticipation. A toxic cocktail of media hype, local gossip, and the raw, electric hum of impending justice. At the center of it all, in a tailored suit that couldn't quite hide the tremor in his hands, sat John Caldwell. He looked smaller than Frank remembered. His legendary charisma curdled into a mask of indignant rage. He was surrounded by a team of high-priced lawyers from Seattle, men who looked as sleek and predatory as sharks. On the other side of the aisle sat the state prosecutor, a young razor-sharp woman named Anya Sharma, who had taken the case when the local DA had conveniently recused himself, citing a conflict of interest that spanned 30 years of friendship with the accused. Beside her, looking grim and resolute, sat Frank Harding. He was the state's star witness. The trial had been a spectacle. Caldwell's lawyers had thrown everything they had at Frank. They painted him as a washed-up, bitter old cop with a vendetta. They painted Marcus Thorne as a disgraced, vindictive journalist looking for revenge. They painted Dale Sterling, who had finally been found and placed in protective custody, as an unreliable, mentally unstable drunk. They had systematically dismantled the state's case, piece by piece, casting doubt on the photos. The testimony, everything. The mood in the courtroom was shifting. The jury looked confused, uncertain. The public, the people of Clallam County who had revered Caldwell for a generation, wanted to believe he was innocent. They wanted to believe this was all a terrible mistake. Frank could feel it slipping away. The weight of Caldwell's legacy was a tangible force, bending the very arc of justice in his favor. The prosecution calls its final witness. Anya Sharma announced, her voice cutting through the tense silence. Mr. John Caldwell. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Caldwell's lead attorney shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor, the prosecution is engaging in theatrics. My client will not be taking the stand. Your client is not on trial for a traffic violation, Counselor Sharma shot back, her eyes flashing. He is on trial for the murder of 3 people, including a 6-year-old child. I believe the jury has a right to hear from him. The judge, a man who owed his career to Caldwell, hesitated. He looked torn, but the eyes of the world were on him. The trial was being streamed live. He knew he couldn't be seen to be protecting his old friend. I'll allow it, the judge said, his voice barely a whisper. Mr. Caldwell, please approach the witness stand. Caldwell, his face a thundercloud, walked to the stand. He moved with the stiff, arrogant gait of a man who could not believe the indignity of it all. He took the oath, his hand on the Bible, and glared at Sharma. Sharma let the silence hang in the air for a moment before she began. She was calm, her questions simple, almost gentle. She walked him through his celebrated career, his years of service, the accolades, the community projects. She was lulling him, stroking his massive ego. Caldwell began to relax. He leaned into the microphone, his voice regaining its familiar, folksy charm. He was John Caldwell, again. Hero, Sheriff, Sharma said, her tone changing, becoming sharper. Let's talk about the day the Peterson family disappeared. You were in charge of the search, correct? I was, Caldwell said, his voice dripping with solemn authority. It was one of the most tragic events of my career. A terrible, terrible thing. You personally interviewed the key witness, a Mr. Dale Sterling. I did, a good simple man, a hunter, knew the woods better than anyone, and he told you he saw the Petersons turn onto a logging road, looking happy and carefree. That's correct, Caldwell said, nodding. It was the lead we followed. We searched that area for weeks, found nothing. Sharma walked over to the prosecution's table and picked up a small, black microcassette recorder. It looked like a relic from another era. Sheriff Caldwell, she said, holding it up for the jury to see. Do you recognize this device? Caldwell's eyes narrowed. A flicker of something heinous, recognition passed across his face. It's a tape recorder. So what? This tape recorder, Sheriff, belonged to your secretary, Evelyn Reed, Sharma said, her voice dropping, becoming cold and precise. The woman who was found dead in her car 19 years ago. The woman whose death was ruled a suicide, despite the fact that she had just bought a plane ticket to see her newborn grandchild in California. Caldwell's face went rigid. The folksy charm vanished, replaced by a cold, reptilian stillness. Evelyn was a troubled woman. I feel for her family, but I don't see what this has to do with anything. Oh, I think it has everything to do with everything, Sharma said. She pressed a button on the recorder. The sound that filled the courtroom was tinny, distorted, but the voice was unmistakable. It was John Caldwell's voice. Younger, stronger, but his. Have to handle it, Evelyn. They can't go to the press. That report would ruin us. Ruin everything we've built. The voice of Evelyn Reed, shaky but firm, replied, This is wrong, John. They're just doing their jobs. He's a surveyor, she's a paralegal. They're good people. Caldwell's recorded voice was cold, ruthless. They're a threat, and we neutralize threats. You know that. I'll talk to them. I'll make them understand. I'll have Dale run them off the road up by the old mill. I'll just have a conversation. The courtroom was utterly silent, Every person in the room was frozen, their eyes locked on the small black recorder, as if it were a venomous snake. Caldwell's lawyers were on their feet, shouting objections, but the judge, his face ashen, waved them silent. Sharma pressed the button again. The tape fast-forwarded with a high-pitched whine. She stopped it. A new voice filled the room. Dale Sterling's voice, panicked, hysterical. It was a recording of a phone call. "You said you were just going to scare them, John. You said, just scare them. I saw you with the tire iron. Oh God, the screaming. I can still hear the little girl screaming." Caldwell's voice was a low, menacing growl. "You saw nothing, Dale. You understand me. You saw a family on a Sunday drive. You will stick to the story, or, so help me God, you will end up in the ground right next to them. Am I clear?" A collective gasp went through the courtroom. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated shock. The truth, raw and undeniable, was washing over them all. The hero they had worshipped was a monster. Caldwell sat on the stand, his face a mask of pure hatred. He was trapped, he was exposed. He looked at the jury, at the faces of the people who had once adored him, and saw only horror and disgust. He looked at Frank Harding, and in his eyes, Frank saw the abyss. Sharma let the silence stretch, letting the horror sink in. Then she walked back to the witness stand, her heels clicking on the marble floor. She stood directly in front of Caldwell, her voice now a quiet, devastating whisper. "Sheriff Caldwell," she said, "you told this court you searched for weeks for the Peterson family. You told the public you would do everything in your power to bring them home, but you knew where they were all along, didn't you? Because you were the one who put them there." She paused, then delivered the final cinematic blow. "There's one more recording, Sheriff. It's from a few days after the murders. It's you, alone in your office, talking to yourself. Or maybe you were talking to God. You talk about the car, you talk about the ravine, and then you say, and I quote, 'The bodies are better, deeper. The old quarry will hold them forever. No one will ever find them there.' It was a bluff. There was no such recording. But in that moment, it didn't matter. The weight of the other tapes, the sheer, overwhelming evidence of his guilt, had broken him. John Caldwell lunged. He didn't lunge at Sharma, he lunged at Frank. With a guttural roar of pure, primal rage, he launched himself over the witness box. His hands outstretched like claws, his face contorted into a mask of insanity. "You!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "You did this! I should have killed you 20 years ago." It was a full confession, screamed in the face of the world. Bailoff swarmed him, tackling him to the ground, just feet from where Frank sat, frozen in his chair. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Cameras flashed, people screamed, and through it all, Frank Harding just stared at the man on the floor. The pathetic, writhing creature who had haunted him for 19 years. The payoff was explosive. It was public. It was absolute. It wasn't just justice, it was exposure. The king had been dethroned. His crimes laid bare for all to see. The cinematic moment wasn't a guilty verdict. It was the monster, stripped of his power, confessing his own evil in a fit of impotent rage. The sound of the gavel, desperately trying to restore order, was drowned out by the sound of an empire crumbling to dust. The circus moved on. The news vans packed up, the talking heads found a new scandal, and the quiet of the Olympic Peninsula returned, settling over the county like a soft blanket of fog. But it was a different kind of quiet now. It was a silence heavy with reflection. With the ghosts of a truth that had been unearthed, John Caldwell died in prison 6 months later. A heart attack in the middle of the night. There was no grand funeral, no procession of mourners. His name was quietly scraped off the hospital wing and the marina sign. His legacy had been erased, his reign of terror reduced to a cautionary tale whispered in local bars. Frank Harding didn't go back to his woodshop. Retirement felt like a foreign country he no longer had a passport for. He stayed on with the State Patrol as a special consultant for cold cases. His newfound purpose, a bomb on a 19-year-old wound. His first official act was to lead a team to the old quarry Caldwell had mentioned in his final bluffed confession. It was a desolate place, a deep scar in the earth, filled with stagnant green water. It took the dive team 2 days, but they found them. The remains of Mark and Sarah Peterson, and their 6-year-old daughter, Lily. They were finally brought home. The funeral was small, private. The only attendees were a few distant relatives, who barely remembered the vibrant young family. Marcus Thorne and Frank. They stood on a grassy hill in a Seattle cemetery, the gray sky weeping a soft, persistent drizzle. 3 simple granite markers stood before them, their names carved into the cold stone. Mark Peterson, Sarah Peterson, Lily Peterson, together forever. Frank stood before Lily's grave, long after the others had left. He thought of her, a little girl in the back seat of a car, seeing the world through the plastic lens of a disposable camera. In the end, her childish curiosity, her innocent act of taking a picture, had been the one thing more powerful than all of Caldwell's greed and violence. She had been the silent witness, her voice finally heard after 19 years of silence. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the faded, worn unicorn backpack. He had kept it. He knelt, his old knees cracking, and laid it gently at the base of the headstone. A final small tribute to the little girl who had solved her own murder. He felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Marcus Thorne. The journalist looked different now. The bitterness in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, weary peace. The trial had vindicated him, restored his name. He was writing again, real stories, important stories. "You did good, Frank," Marcus said, his voice quiet. "She did good," Frank corrected, nodding towards the small grave marker. "We just listened." They stood there for a while, 2 old soldiers at the end of a long war, the silence between them comfortable, shared. The rain began to fall harder, washing over the granite, making the carved names glisten. A few weeks later, Frank drove back out to the ravine. The police tape was gone. The forest was already reclaiming the space. New growth covering the scars in the earth where the station wagon had rested. He walked to the spot where the car had been, the place where he had opened that pink backpack, and changed the course of so many lives. He wasn't looking for anything. He just wanted to stand there, in the place where the story had ended and begun. He wanted to feel the quiet of the woods, not as an oppressive, menacing force, but as a silent guardian that had held its secrets until the right person came along to hear them. As he turned to leave, a flash of color on the ground caught his eye. He knelt down and picked it up. It was a single small object half buried in the pine needles, a plastic barrette shaped like a yellow star. It must have fallen from Lily's hair, lost in the chaos of that terrible afternoon. He held it in the palm of his hand, a tiny, insignificant piece of plastic, but it felt as heavy as the world. It was a reminder, a haunting echo of the life that had been stolen, of the laughter that had been silenced. The cost of truth had been immeasurable. A family annihilated, a town corrupted, lives ruined. He closed his hand around the barrette, the sharp points of the star digging into his palm. Justice had been served, a monster had been caged, and the dead had been laid to rest. But there was no victory here. There was no catharsis that could erase the 19 years of silence. The 19 years a family lay lost and unmourned in a watery grave. The healing was bittersweet, a fragile thing. The truth had come out, but it couldn't bring them back. All it could do was allow them to be remembered. Frank walked out of the forest, the little yellow star clutched in his hand, a tragic, poignant reminder that even when the ghosts are finally put to rest, they leave a piece of themselves behind, a lingering emotional echo in the quiet places of the world. The story was over, but the silence that followed was a story in itself.